Hello again. So we're going to pick up talking about public opinion. And now we're going to turn our attention to measuring public opinion. This is the sciencey, mathy part of public opinion. But trust me when I say you can understand this, right? All right. Once again, I'm going to share my screen. Come on. Measuring public opinion. Okay. So we measure public opinion through a process called polling, or sometimes it's referred to as survey research. Basically, you figure out what people believe by asking them. So you call up a bunch of people on the phone and you say, do you have 5 minutes to talk to me about your political attitudes? And then you ask them some demographic questions, what's your race, what's your gender, what's your age, et cetera. And then you start asking questions like, if I were to tell you that blah, 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 how would you feel? Or on a scale of 1 to 10, how positive are your feelings about Joe Biden? Right? You ask people questions and then you literally add it up. But believe it or not, public opinion polling or survey research is a science. There are people who have backgrounds in psychology, in political science, and statistics who make buckets of money measuring public opinion well, right? Because it is hard to do well. I promise you, very hard to do well. Some of the questions or the primary areas of concern are something called sampling error, which has to do with how many people you ask, something called selection bias, which has to do with who you ask, and then something called measurement error, which is a function of what your questions are. Are your questions actually asking what you think they're asking? So let's look at each of these individually. So sampling error relates to or refers to the error that we get because we can't ask everybody in America. M&Ms. Love M&Ms. Do I have that up? I do. I have it right side up. I love M&Ms. I got from my mom. Imagine you wanted to know what percentage of M&Ms are green. Well, now you can just ask the internet and M&M Mars will tell you. But imagine it's 1980 and there is no internet and you want to know what percentage of M&Ms are green. So you can't collect all of the M&Ms in the country. It's not possible. But you can pick some bags, right? And you can figure out what percentage of M&Ms in a given bag are green, right? If you get let's say you get one of those little snack size bags. Those are just cruel, right? One of those little Halloween size bags. And you open it up and there are no green M&Ms. Does that mean that there are no green M&Ms? Of course not. But it's possible because it says very tiny number of M&Ms in one of those bags. It's possible that you're going to get a bag that doesn't reflect the true population. Maybe you get a share size bag, right? Now you're probably getting closer. But really, you probably want more than that. Really, you probably want like a family size bag. If you count the M&Ms in a family size bag, maybe in the first family size bag, you get 51%. Oh, you're not going to get 51%. You're going to get 20% green M&Ms. Then you get another family size bag and you count the M&Ms and you find that you have 24% green. It's not the same, but it's close. right? So sampling error refers to the accuracy or our certainty that our observed result, the number of green M&Ms in our bag, is reflective of the population as a whole, of all M&Ms. So the more people you ask in your survey, the smaller your sampling error, the smaller your margin of error. I'll tell you what that means in just a second. There is sort of a limit, right? If you, let's go back to our M&Ms. If you get a family-sized bag of M&Ms, you're not going to have a perfect representation of the world of M&Ms. You're going to get a little closer if you get a second family-sized bag. Let's say you get a third family-sized bag. I mean, you might get a little closer, but you're not going to be gaining that much certainty relative to the amount of time it takes to count those M&Ms. The same is true with the number of people that we survey in a public opinion poll. After a certain number of people, we're pretty confident in our result, and we don't get much more certainty by adding people. Believe it or not, it's not that many people. About 1,500 people, if they are randomly chosen, something we'll talk about in a second, 1,500 people is a pretty good number for getting an accurate representation of all Americans. I promise you. It seems crazy, but it's true. So let's talk about this margin of error. When you read a poll, right, when you read the results of a survey on, say, CNN or Fox News or something like that, or the New York Times, what you'll see is like 53% of those surveyed said that they supported Biden's economic policy. And then in parentheses, it will say margin of error plus or minus 3%. That's really important because what that means, all right, so we're looking here at a bell curve, right? A bell curve is shaped like a bell. And it's actually a distribution of probabilities. Oh, that sounds horrible. So imagine that this number right here, right, smack in the middle, is our observed result. That's our 53% of those surveyed said that they supported Biden's economic policy. That's our observed result. The margin of error is plus or minus 3%. So between 50% and 56%. And when a polling firm says that the margin of error is plus or minus 3%, that means that if we were to somehow magically know the actual percentage of all Americans who supported Biden's plan, right? Magically know that. There is a 95% chance that that actual number is between 50% and 56%, right? Our observed numbers in the middle, plus or minus 3%, we are 95% sure that the truth is in that window. Is it possible that we did a survey and 53% of the people we asked said they supported Biden's economic package, and really only 20% of Americans support his economic package? It's possible. It's just really unlikely, right? So what we are statistically sure of or statistically confident in is that if we've asked enough people and we can get our margin of error down to plus or minus 3%, which is kind of the gold standard, we are 95% certain that the truth lies between our observed value minus 3% and our observed value plus 3%. Okay, so again, Sampling error refers to the possibility that our sample does not accurately reflect the real population. The margin of error is the amount of error we give ourselves in order to stay 95% certain of the result. Now, this is important. What if you do a survey and you know, based on the number of people you sampled, that you have a margin of error of plus or minus 3%. And your observed result is that 51% of people support Biden's economic package. That means the truth, we're 95% certain that the truth lies between 48 and 54%. But there's a big difference between 48 and 54%, because 48%, 49%, 49.9%, less than half, right? So if your result is close to that 50% mark, because of the margin of error, you can't actually be certain whether the truth is below 50% or above 50%. And we often consider that to be an important figure. Okay, sampling error, total math. Selection bias starts to get into the art of survey research. Selection bias refers to who we ask. The first question we need to address is, what's the relevant population? Let's say you're a politician and you want to know what people think about abortion. Sorry, I keep using abortion today. I don't know why. So that's what you're interested in. If you are a representative if you're a senator from the state of Texas, chances are good you are not interested in a nationwide survey on abortion attitudes. You're interested in what Texans believe. If you are in the House of Representatives, you're even more specific. You care about what your constituents in your district, what they believe. You don't care if you're representing a district in Dallas, you don't care what the people in Houston think. You care about the people in Dallas. Similarly, you probably don't care about all people. You probably only care about people who are over the age of 18 and eligible to vote. You may actually only be interested in what we call likely voters, people who are likely to cast a ballot. So you're not really interested in the people who sit home, right? I don't care about what they think because they're not going to get me reelected. So you first want to know what your relevant population is, whose opinion matters to you. Then you need to make sure that within that population, you're taking a random sample. Let's imagine that we're interested in parking at UNT. And you're interested in whether students want to spend an additional fee or pay an additional fee for more parking. So your relevant population, is it all students, or is it only students who commute? Or is it students who have a car? Let's say you're really interested in all students who have a car, but you decide to collect responses by setting up a table with a survey in Kerr Hall, the dorm. You are not going to get a random sample of students with a car by setting up a table in Kerr Hall. You're going to get dorm residents who have a car, but all of your commuter residents are probably not going to go to Kerr Hall. Food there's not that great, right? They're not going to go to, you're just not going to catch them, right? So you're going to have this skewed perspective of how students feel about spending more money on parking, because you're not necessarily asking a random sample. So part of getting a random sample is asking the right people. traditionally, the gold standard for asking a random sample of people was something called CATI, which is computer-assisted telephone interviewing. So you have, it's also sometimes referred to as random digit dialing. So you just have your computer goes boop, 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 and calls somebody, literally a random phone number. And maybe you specify what the prefixes are because you're only interested in a particular geographic area or whatever, but you're randomly calling numbers. So you want to be asking the right people. CATI has become problematic because until now you have to use a special form of computer-aided or computer-assisted telephone interviewing software that will reach cell phones, because the traditional CATI software would only contact landlines. And there are so many people who don't have landlines now that you couldn't get a random sample. But let's say you got the deluxe version of CATI and it's going to contact cell phones. Okay, now we have to worry about who answers. This is sometimes called non-response bias. So let's do our computer-aided or computer-assisted telephone interviews, and our computer is contacting people who have cell phones all across the country. I don't know about you, but I don't answer the phone if I don't recognize the phone number. That is what's called unit non-response. You have people who will not answer. Either they don't pick up the phone, so you can't reach them, or they do pick up the phone and you say, I'm calling to ask your opinions about blah, blah, blah. And they say, no, thank you, click, because they are busy, because they don't care, because they are afraid that you are tracking them for the FBI, or any number of other reasons. They just won't answer you. If that's a random assortment of people, then it doesn't matter because you're still getting a random assortment of people who do answer. But it's not a random assortment of people. It's younger people are less likely to answer those questions than older people. People who are very conservative are less likely to answer survey responses because of the sort of government paranoia thing. So you actually lose whole chunks of your survey, and that's really problematic. In addition, there's something called item non-response. So let's imagine that you're doing your survey and you call up Joe, and Joe says, yeah, I'll answer your questions. And you start asking about demographics, and you start asking him about Biden's economic policies, and Joe's having a great time, right? He's talking to you, it's wonderful. But then you ask Joe, how do you feel about Black people? Joe won't answer that question. Right? As I don't know why you're asking that. I don't want to be trapped here. I'm not going to answer that question. Or you ask him what he feels about abortion, right? Or something else that is sensitive to him, that he sees as potentially a trap, or he recognizes that his opinions are perhaps not consistent with social expectations. And if he answers correctly or honestly, he's going to look bad, right? He may just refuse to answer that question. So you have to take into consideration the people who are not answering your survey and the people who are answering your survey, but maybe they're not answering a specific question. There are all sorts of really interesting statistical techniques that survey researchers use to fill in those blanks for the people who won't answer either all or part of the survey. And again, that's why they get paid lots of money, because it's difficult to do well, but it's important, because otherwise you end up with results where you're just not counting the position of a huge group of people. So the results don't mean anything. Okay, let's talk about measurement error. This is error that arises because you ask bad questions. So here are some of the problems. One is something called salience. Let's say I am interested in how people feel about members of the UNT faculty participating in the state teacher retirement fund. And I ask students at UNT. It's possible, especially if I say, do you think they should or not, right? If I force people to take a side, they'll be like, yeah, they should. Or, nah, they shouldn't. Well, they don't care. They don't care at all. You guys don't care whether I participate in the teacher employee retirement service. If you ask faculty, they care because it's their money, right? Salience is something important to you. Is it relevant to you so that you actually have an opinion and you're not just saying yes or no because it's a coin flip, right? So if you ask questions that are low salience, you really can't rely on the results. If I ask you all about faculty participation in the employee retirement plan, and 80% of you say that yes, we should participate, that doesn't really mean anything because you guys, like I said, you just probably don't care. It's okay. It's okay. You don't have to care. I don't expect you to care. But I don't want, say, the president of the university or the board of regents making decisions about my participation in an employee retirement system based on the opinion of students who do not care, right? Another problem is asking confusing questions. So questions that use big words, right? Words that people don't normally use in their conversation, or questions that involve complex sentence structure. So people lose track of what the actual question is by the time you reach the end. If you're asking those types of questions, again, you can't rely on the accuracy of the results because people can't answer a question accurately if they do not understand the question. The flip side of this is asking oversimplified questions. So for example, if I ask you, are you pro-choice or pro-life? Do you favor legal abortion or not? Most people have more subtle beliefs about that issue. They are not just pro-choice or pro-life. They have beliefs about, the conditions under which they're pro-choice or pro-life, what those words mean, what are the other policies that are in place. It's just too simple a question. And while it's kind of a moderately interesting result, it doesn't necessarily help you make policy because you're not getting at the nuances of what people think. Another thing that you really have to watch for when you're asking survey questions is that you don't use value-laden terms. I believe your textbook talks about push polling. Push polling is when you ask a question intending to get a specific response, trying to force people to say something or to even change their minds, right? Classic example of push polling. When John McCain and George W. Bush were both running for the Republican nomination for president, this is back a ways, there was a group. It wasn't George W. Bush's campaign, wasn't his people, but there was a group that was in favor of George W. Bush, and they did a survey in, I believe it was South Carolina, where they said, if I told you that John McCain fathered an illegitimate Black child, how would you feel about him becoming president? I'm paraphrasing. It was substantively, it was the same, but it was a better worded question. That wasn't true. It wasn't a true thing. And it was 100% the question. They weren't asking the question because they cared how people responded. They were asking the question trying to change people's minds about John McCain, trying to use racism against John McCain. Again, it wasn't George W. Bush's people. It was an outside group, but nevertheless. A value-laden question is often a mistake. So maybe you ask a question about whether people support welfare benefits. A surprisingly large number of people have a very negative response to the word welfare. If instead you ask whether people support income support or emergency income support or a social safety net, they're much more likely to say yes. That word welfare triggers something for people. It's a value-laden question. It leads people towards a response. But again, when we're talking about value-laden questions, we're not talking about trying to lead people to a response. We're talking about doing it accidentally, not knowing that you're screwing up your results. Oops. Finally, there's the issue of question order. If you ask a question about raising taxes, and then you ask a question about spending more money on education. Also say those are your two questions. If you ask the tax question first, a lot of people are gonna say, I don't want you to raise taxes. And then you ask them, well, should we spend more money on education? Oh, crap, I just said that we shouldn't raise taxes. So no, we shouldn't spend more money on education. Now flip the questions. Should we spend more money on education? Of course we should. Education is fantastic. Should we raise taxes? I just said we should spend more money on education. So yeah, I guess we should raise taxes, right? The order in which you ask the questions, a person's response to one question, or the words or the thoughts or the considerations that come from that question influence how they answer the next question. We get around this problem by saying, okay, if we've got these two questions that may interact with each other, we separate them. So we ask a bunch of other unrelated questions in the middle, or we ask half the people the tax question and then the education question, and we ask the other half of the people the education question and then the tax question, and then we can see, does it matter what order we ask the questions in? And if it does, that kind of gives us something interesting to ponder. So there are ways around this. You need to recognize when questions are boring or unimportant to people. You need to use clear, precise language and provide options that are appropriate to answer the question. You need to avoid oversimplifying issues, but at the same time, avoid overcomplicating issues. You need to use words that don't have emotional charges. And then you need to be cognizant of the way your questions can interact with each other. So again, doing a poll, doing it well, is very difficult. It costs a lot of money, both to hire people to do it well, and then also to actually fund the people who sit around calling people, right? Like the sort of telemarketers of the polling world. It's just expensive. And very frequently mistakes are made, even when you have professional pollsters. So if you're a politician and you're afraid that you're trying to rely on polling results in order to make good policy that's going to get you reelected, but you don't trust the polling results, what are you supposed to do? The first is you don't take those polls too seriously, right? If you have been voting against abortion rights for 20 years and it keeps getting you reelected, and then a poll pops up in your constituency that seems to suggest that your constituents now favor abortion rights, don't switch your policy. Like, don't just switch right now. That's a mistake. Hold off. See if you get a few more polls that say the same thing, right? Try to figure out what's changed, if anything. It could just be a fluke, right? It could just have been a weird survey, a poorly worded survey. You don't want to make a major life decision like changing your position on abortion based on a single poll. Don't do it. The other thing you can do as a politician, and this makes people angry sometimes, but watch politicians. A lot of times they avoid position issues like being in favor of abortion rights or against abortion rights in favor of what we call valence issues. Valence issues are things that everyone agrees on. So this is an ad for Pedigree dog food. And it's got this adorable little puppy. If he were a cat, we would say he's calico. I don't know what you say when it's a dog, but he's adorable and he's got a cute little nose and he's little glowing eyes. He's just beautiful. And the ad says, "We're for puppies, a wet nose, a warm belly, and a wagging tail. We're for playing, romping, gnawing, and nipping. And we're for helping them grow up healthy and strong. Dogs rule." I dare you to find the person who disagrees with this. Who hates puppies? Nobody. Nobody. There are people who don't love puppies, but nobody hates puppies. Nobody. So in the political world, things like, I favor education. I favor a strong economy. I favor a reliable military force. Who's against that? Everyone wants the economy to be strong. Everyone wants education. Everyone wants to know that we're safe. Everyone, favors firemen, right? I mean, everybody favors these things. Nobody's going to be opposed to education. If you start getting real specific about how you're going to improve education, now you can start to tick some people off. But if you just say, I favor education, I'm in favor of strong education, no one is going to be mad at that. No one. So if you're a politician and you're not really sure what your constituents believe, go with I'm for puppies, because you're just not going to make any of them angry. Okay, that's it for now. Bye-bye.